Have you ever wondered what happens when a place remembers your name before you even arrive? What if the voice calling to you from the dark is not an echo, but something waiting for you to answer? What if the road you took to escape was the very trap designed to bring you back? The asphalt of Route 9 drifted into the dense, suffocating embrace of the Blackwood National Forest in western Oregon. For miles, the towering Douglas firs blocked out the fading autumn sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hood of the dusty Jeep. Behind the wheel, David Miller kept his hands tightly gripped at 10 and 2, his knuckles white against the leather. At 32, David possessed the rugged, quiet resilience of a man who spent his life building things. But the sudden, unexplained disappearance of his younger sister Chloe 3 weeks ago had left him hollowed out, fueled only by a desperate, burning need for answers. In the passenger seat sat Elena, his wife, her eyes scanning a frayed paper map. In the back, Marcus, David's lifelong friend and a former tracking specialist, adjusted his gear in tense silence, while Sarah, Chloe's best friend, stared blankly out the window, her fingers anxiously twisting a silver locket around her neck. According to the last ping on Chloe's phone, she was heading toward the old Blackwood timber camp, Elena said, her voice cutting through the hum of the engine. But David, the park ranger, said that area was abandoned in the late 70s. There's nothing out there but miles of dead growth. She wouldn't just walk into the woods and vanish, Elena, David replied, his tone clipped but resolute. The police gave up. They think she ran away. You know Chloe. She was investigating something. That camp means something. David's right, Marcus chimed in, his deep voice grounded and calm. But these woods aren't a joke. If we don't find her vehicle before sundown, we set up camp and wait for daylight. Blackwood gets pitch black, and the terrain drops off into deep ravines. The Jeep rounded a sharp, narrow bend, and the tires suddenly crunched onto gravel. The paved road ended abruptly, swallowed by overgrown weeds and rusted chain-link fencing that had long since collapsed. Ahead lay the timber trail, a claustrophobic path flanked by trees that seemed to lean inward, blocking out the sky. As the vehicle rolled past the perimeter, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon them. The ambient sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals, instantly vanished. They drove for another hour in eerie stillness, until the trail dead-ended into a small clearing. There, sitting beneath the shadow of a massive dead oak tree, was Chloe's white sedan. The car was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and dried mud. The driver's side door hung wide open, creaking softly in the breeze. David killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to make their ears ring. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, pressing her hand to her mouth. They exited the Jeep, the sound of their boots breaking dry twigs echoing like gunshots in the quiet air. David rushed to the sedan, his heart hammering against his ribs. The interior was pristine, yet deeply disturbing. Chloe's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet, cash, and ID untouched. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the on position, though the battery had long since died. "Look at this," Marcus said, kneeling by the driver's side door. He pointed a flashlight at the muddy ground. Footprints. Her boots. She stepped out of the vehicle in a hurry. "But look here." He moved the beam a few inches to the left. "There are no returning tracks, just one set leading straight into the tree line. And then, nothing." "What do you mean, nothing?" Elena asked, shivering as a sudden freezing gust of wind swept through the clearing. "The tracks just stop, Elena. Like she vanished into thin air, or—" Marcus trailed off, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of trees. Sarah stepped back from the vehicle, her boots crunching on something metallic. She looked down and gasped. Half buried in the dirt was a strange, rusted iron symbol. It was a circle, violently crossed by 3 jagged lines that formed an irregular, distorted eye. "David, look at this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Chloe sent me a photo of this exact symbol the night before she went missing. She found it carved into an old book at the university library. She said it was called the Mark of the Unseen. David took the heavy iron piece, a cold chill radiating from the metal straight into his palm. As he held it, a sudden, sharp ringing filled his ears. The air grew perceptibly colder, their breath turning into white plumes. "Did you hear that?" Elena whispered suddenly, her eyes wide with fear as she stared into the dense brush. "Hear what?" David asked, trying to shake the disorientation from his mind. "Someone called my name," Elena said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. It sounded just like my mother. But she's back in Seattle. "It's just the wind playing tricks, Elena. The trees create weird acoustics out here," Marcus said, though his hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "We need to set up camp right here. It's getting too dark to move safely." They pitched 2 tents near the vehicles, using the Jeep's headlights to illuminate the perimeter. By the time they finished, the forest had become an absolute abyss. The darkness was total, a physical weight that seemed to press against the fragile circle of their campfire. Dinner was eaten in a tense, anxious silence. Every crackle of the burning wood made them jump. Around 11 p.m., exhaustion finally overtook them, and they retreated to their tents. David and Elena shared one, while Marcus and Sarah took the other. David lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent. Beside him, Elena's breathing had stabilized into sleep, but he could feel the unnatural tension in the air. Time seemed to warp. He checked his watch. It read 11:45 p.m. He closed his eyes for what felt like hours, tossing and turning, trapped in a state of vivid waking nightmares. In his mind, he saw Chloe running through the dark woods, her face pale, screaming his name, chased by a towering shadow that had no definitive shape. He snapped his eyes open, dripping with cold sweat. He checked his watch again. It still read 11:45 p.m. The ticking second hand was frozen, vibrating violently in place. Suddenly a sound echoed through the campground. It was the distinct heavy crunch of footsteps on gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. David froze, his muscles locking. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling their tents. "Marcus?" David called out in a low, harsh whisper, trying not to wake Elena. No response. The footsteps stopped right outside David's tent. Through the thin fabric, illuminated by the dying embers of the fire, David saw a shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin and distorted, its limbs elongated at unnatural angles. Then a voice drifted through the fabric. It was soft, melodic, and chillingly familiar. "David, help me. It's so cold out here." It was Chloe's voice. It sounded exactly like her, yet there was an underlying layer to it, a hollow vibrating resonance that sounded like 2 voices speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. "Chloe?" David gasped, his protective instincts overriding his terror. He unzipped the tent flap with a violent jerk and shone his tactical flashlight into the dark. The clearing was empty. The dying fire cast long, dancing shadows across the trees, but there was no one there. "David, what's happening?" Elena woke up, her voice laced with panic. Across the clearing, Marcus and Sarah tumbled out of their tent, Marcus holding a heavy-duty flashlight, his face pale. "I heard it too, David," Marcus breathed, his eyes darting wildly into the woods. It called Sarah's name. It sounded just like her brother. "It was Chloe," David said, his voice shaking. "She's out there. She's alive." He reached inside, violently ripping the keys out of the ignition. The static cut out instantly. The dashboard lights died. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. But as the light from David's flashlight swept across the interior of the car, he froze. Pressed against the inside of the shattered windshield, written in thick, dark grease, was a message: "You are already inside." David stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down at the keys in his hand. They weren't Chloe's keys. Attached to the rusted keyring was an old, tarnished brass key with a number stamped into the metal. Room 104. "We stay together," Marcus instructed, raising his rifle. "No one separates for any reason." They moved down the long, narrow corridor of the first floor. The doors to the rooms were all numbered in faded brass digits, 101, 102, 103. They stopped in front of room 104. The door was painted a deep, blood-red color, completely untouched by the rot that plagued the rest of the building. David stepped forward, his heart pounding in his throat, and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. He pushed the door open. The room was not a hotel room. It was a massive, concrete observation chamber. In the center of the room sat a single, old-fashioned, reel-to-reel tape recorder resting on a metal table. Dust motes danced in the beam of their flashlights. David walked to the table. The tape recorder was threaded with a thick tape. Written on the plastic casing in black marker was a date, October 14th, 1974. "What is this place?" Elena whispered, looking at the concrete walls, which were covered in frantic, overlapping tally marks scratched into the stone. David pressed the play button. The reels began to spin slowly, emitting a low hiss of static before a man's voice echoed through the speaker. The voice was frantic, breathless, and laced with absolute terror. "This is Dr. Arthur Vance, lead researcher at the Blackwood Anomalous Site. It's day 42 since the extraction team broke through the lower cavern. The entity. It doesn't exist in our space. It uses the trees, the roots, the very geometry of this valley to manifest. It's a closed loop. Once you enter its perimeter, your past, your future, your memories, they all become fuel for its construction. It copies us. It speaks with our voices. If you hear your loved ones calling from the dark, do not answer. It is constructing a doorway. The numbers. The numbers are the coordinates to the lower chamber. 4112. God help us, we opened the floor. The recording was abruptly cut off by a deafening, inhuman shriek that tore through the speaker, a sound that combined a human scream with the sound of grinding metal and tearing wood. The tape snapped, spinning wildly on the reel. "A closed loop," Marcus whispered, his face completely drained of color. "That's why the trail didn't end. We aren't in Oregon anymore. We're inside whatever this thing is." Suddenly, the heavy concrete door of room 104 violently slammed shut behind them. The lock engaged with a deafening metallic snap. "Marcus! David!" Sarah screamed. The flashlight beams began to flicker violently. The temperature in the room plummeted until their skin stung with the cold. From the corners of the room, the shadows began to detach themselves from the walls. They didn't move like natural shadows. They rose up like black, viscous liquid, stretching toward the ceiling. Amidst the darkness, a figure began to form in the center of the room, rising directly out of the concrete floor. It was Chloe. "Chloe!" David yelled, taking a step forward, but Marcus violently tackled him to the ground. "David, look at her face!" Marcus roared. The entity that looked like Chloe stood perfectly still. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale and translucent. But her eyes were gone. In place of her eyes were two hollow, endless voids of pitch blackness. When she opened her mouth to speak, it didn't open like a human mouth. Her jaw unhinged unnaturally, dropping down to her chest. From that gaping black void, a voice emerged. It wasn't Chloe's. It was David's own voice, speaking in a distorted metallic reverse. "Thank you for bringing them to me, David." Before anyone could react, the concrete floor beneath Sarah violently cracked. A massive black rotted pine root erupted from the stone, wrapping tightly around her waist. "David! Elena! Help me!" Sarah screamed as she was violently jerked backward. Marcus fired his rifle twice into the shadow, the loud cracks deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullets passed right through the darkness, striking the concrete wall behind it. With a horrific snapping sound, the wall behind Sarah opened up like a gaping mouth, and she was dragged backward into the darkness, her screams echoing down into an unseen abyss before cutting off completely. The room fell dead silent again. The figure of Chloe dissolved into a cloud of black ash, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical ticking of David's frozen watch. On the wall where Sarah had disappeared, a new door had manifested. It was made of rusted iron, and carved into the metal were the numbers 4112. The loss of Sarah left them in catatonic shock, but the collapsing concrete walls of room 104 gave them no time to grieve. David gripped the iron handle of the door marked 4112. It was ice cold, but he threw his weight against it, revealing a steep spiral staircase carved into the living rock. They descended in single file into a colossal underground cavern. The floor was a pulsing network of black rotted tree roots, the heartbeat of the forest. Embedded within the roots were the remains of people from different eras. In the center, wrapped tightly in a cocoon of living wood, was Chloe. Her skin was already turning into a dark, bark-like texture. "Chloe," David screamed, sprinting across the vibrating floor. The moment he stepped onto the roots, the entire cavern erupted. From the ceiling, the entity descended, a towering mass of black wood and shifting, translucent human faces. A massive vertical tear in its center pulsed with a blinding pale blue light. Marcus opened fire, but the creature swept a massive wooden limb, launching him across the cavern into the stone wall. He collapsed, motionless. David reached Chloe, frantically hacking at the rubbery roots with his hunting knife. "David." Chloe's eyes fluttered open, her voice weak. "It builds itself out of our minds." The towering entity loomed directly over them, its body morphing to mirror the faces of David's past. "David," the entity spoke in a chorus of familiar voices. "Why do you fight? Your memories live forever in the dark." Fueled by pure rage, David lunged forward, driving his knife deep into the pulsing blue core. The entity unleashed a reality-shattering shriek. A blinding wave of energy erupted, throwing David backward as the cavern floor began to disintegrate. "David, grab Chloe!" Elena screamed, dragging Marcus's unconscious body toward the stairs. David scrambled through the falling debris, hoisted Chloe onto his shoulders and ran. They bolted up the crumbling staircase and sprinted through the collapsing lodge, throwing themselves into the dirt, just as the entire structure imploded into dust. David gasped for air. The thick fog and unnatural trees were gone. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, and less than 50 yards away lay the paved asphalt of Route 9. The loop was broken. 3 days later, the warmth of a Seattle hospital room provided a stark contrast to the darkness. Marcus was recovering from broken ribs, and Chloe was resting quietly, her physical injuries healing. David sat beside her bed holding Elena's hand. "It's over," Elena whispered. "We're safe." David nodded, his chest finally feeling light. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. The caller ID displayed a sequence of numbers, 4112. His heart dropped. He slowly brought the phone to his ear. Through a heavy layer of radio static, his own voice whispered back to him, "Have you ever wondered what happens when a place remembers your name?" The line went dead, and the mechanical hands of the hospital wall clock violently froze in place.